Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Rising. It's Tuesday, July 20th, and we have a big show for you today. But first, we want to get right to an update out of Haiti. The self-appointed interim Prime Minister Claude Joseph, who stepped into the position following the assassination of President Jovenel Moise, has agreed to step down. Ariel Henry will take the post. Moise appointed Henry as prime minister just 2 days before his death, but he was never formally sworn in. Ryan, what do you make of this development?
Well, so the reporting that we're getting is that the U.S. and its international partners basically pushed Claude Joseph out of this position and insisted that Ariel Henry take office, which just goes to the centuries-long pattern of the U.S. very much treating Haiti like a client state and dictating to it what the terms are. Claude Joseph, you might remember, after he kind of named himself the interim leader in the wake of Moise's assassination, asked the United States to send troops to Haiti, which seemed to be a way to kind of try to ingratiate himself into the graces of the United States, in the hopes that they would then look at him and say, well, this is an awfully pliant ruler. He's literally asking for us to send troops.
So why didn't that work?
Well, so there is a lot of reporting that the United States and other international partners were quite upset with the way that Moise was handling the situation, that they felt like he had become a liability. He was so unpopular that while he may have been carrying out the agenda of the United States, he was doing it ineffectively, and he was creating essentially revolution in the streets. A lot of the street gangs were becoming politicized and radicalized, and he was bringing too much instability to the country. And there was no evidence that Joseph was going to satisfy any of the demands. Now, there's no evidence that Henry either.
I was just going to ask.
This is just another United States installed interim leader. So it's difficult to see how that is much of a significant improvement.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it seems like a distinction, sort of a superficial distinction, but is there a deeper distinction between Joseph and Henry?
No, not a significant enough one that it's going to fundamentally change things on the ground. And we continue to get new reporting about the people behind the assassination. My colleague at The Intercept, Ryan Devereaux, is reporting that at least 7 of the 25 Colombian soldiers suspected of assassinating Haitian President Jovenel Moise were trained by the United States military at some point. Some of the training took place as recently as 2015 and included vehicle maintenance, counterterrorism, drug war operations. Joining us now to unpack all of this is investigative reporter at The Intercept, Ryan Devereaux. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So can you talk a little bit about why it is that Colombians are the mercenaries that you're most likely to see in situations like this, and why you're most likely to find that some of them were trained by the United States?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and it goes back decades. And you can really trace this back to the sort of 1960s, where the U.S. started getting involved in Colombia in the sort of internal conflict there through the U.S. military. But it really picked up in the 80s and 90s, and then in particular in the year 2000 with Plan Colombia. So if you look at this period of time in which the U.S. government tells us that these 7 Colombians were trained by the United States, it's 2001 to 2015. This decade and a half long period is when Plan Colombia, this massive counter-drug, counter-narcotics aid package, went into effect. It's a period in which the United States spent $10 billion fighting the drug war in Colombia, which, we called it the drug war, but it was really wrapped up in a much more complex sort of counterinsurgency conflict. Over that period of time, Colombians, the Colombian military was sort of working hand in glove with the United States, with some of the most elite elements of the U.S. military and intelligence apparatus, going after the FARC leaders, the sort of insurrectionist movement there in Colombia, and as that sort of relationship evolved, as the Colombians developed a reputation for being the sort of most advanced military in Latin America, their stock rose in the private security and mercenary sphere, to the point where by 2011 you had the New York Times reporting that Eric Prince, the sort of infamous head, the most infamous mercenary organization of all time, Blackwater, was recruiting hundreds of Colombians for the UAE for their war in Yemen. By 2015, you have Colombian troops starting to show up on Yemeni battlefields. You also have reports of Colombian officers and soldiers sort of turning to Mexican organized crime and training cartels in the drug war there, which itself was sort of modeled in the United States approach after the Colombia approach. Plan Colombia became the model for the U.S. drug war in Mexico. So Colombia and Colombian veterans have really loomed large in the sort of private security and mercenary world vis-a-vis their close relationship to the United States. It's actually become such a major headache for sort of leadership of the Colombian military. They have a hard time keeping these guys around because they can't match the kind of prices that a country like the UAE can offer their soldiers. So it's not at all surprising that Colombians turn up in this story. I mean, just to give you some idea, over this sort of period in which these guys were trained, there were more than 107,000 Colombian security forces personnel who went through various courses administered by the United States. I mean, it's just, there's no comparison. Plan Colombia at $10 billion. And no other country aside from Israel and Egypt received that kind of military aid over that period of time.
So you report that family members of the detained mercenaries, the detained Colombians, say they believe that they were hired to provide personal security for VIP. How credible do you find that story?
Yeah, well, I mean, sorting through all of the competing accounts and different versions of events of what happened and did not happen on July 7th in Haiti has been extraordinarily difficult. And we should just sort of keep in mind that so much of what we're hearing is coming from Haitian authorities and Colombian authorities. The men who are held in custody have been basically held incommunicado. And so we have to take a lot of what we're being told with a grain of salt. However, the sort of latest description of what may have happened here, and this is coming from the Colombians, including the Colombian president, is that there was a group of Colombian mercenaries within the larger group who were clued in to the actual plan for this operation, which was to assassinate the president. Somewhere around 7 of these mercenaries out of the larger set knew what was going to happen, and it was that group that allegedly entered the president's home and while on the phone trying to identify who their target was, made a beeline for the president and assassinated him there in his bedroom. While families of the other Colombians who were part of this operation say, my husband believed that he was going to Haiti for a mission to protect some sort of VIP. Details were vague, but the money was great. It was something like $2,500 to $3,500 a month, potentially, a life-changing sum of money for a lot of these guys. I mean, part of the problem for the Colombian military in keeping these guys around is that they struggle outside of the military to find work. So I feel like that will draw those kinds of vets to a vaguely defined job in a foreign country. It's not all that uncommon. While we talk about some of the sort of splashier headline stories of what happens in the private security and mercenary world, a lot of this stuff, I mean, it's very common. It is VIP security. It's infrastructure security. It happens all the time. So, is it plausible that some of these Colombians might have known what they were actually being sent to Haiti to do, while others didn't? Yeah, I think it's plausible. But again, this story is incredibly murky, and it could take weeks, months, years before we really get to the bottom of what happened.
Yeah, and Ryan, you might remember a couple of weeks ago, I reported at the same outlet, The Intercept, that the Bolivian defense minister was trying to bring mercenaries, into the country to stop MAS, the movement towards socialism, from taking power after the election. And we were able to actually review the recruitment materials that the U.S. mercenaries had sent around to their networks trying to get people on board. And they described it in vague terms, but suggested that it was a law enforcement training partnership, that people were going to be brought in to work with local law enforcement and train them up. There were some clues within the messaging that everything wasn't on the up and up because they were saying it depends on political circumstances. Make sure you dress casually and don't give away, that you are a foreign fighter being brought in. And then you're like, well, why if this is on the up and up? But seeing the way that they lied about it being a police training exercise gives me some credence that if you're recruiting kind of broadly, you actually would kind of lie to people, because you don't want to say, hey, we're bringing you on board here in order to assassinate the Haitian president.
Assassins wanted. It's
right,
like at the Starbucks.
Right, that's gonna get you hung up in some places you don't want to be hung up in. Yeah. So it's much better to say, we've got a VIP who needs security. Ryan, I'm curious if other elements of the elite, either in Colombia, Haiti, United States, or elsewhere, are starting to recognize the threat that these privatized forces now present to governments around the hemisphere.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and time will tell. I mean, I think that there is a conversation happening about this sort of thing and this kind of threat right now. But it's also worth keeping in mind that we're 2 decades into the war on terror, and this sort of outsourcing of security and combat and warfare has been a major part of that history. It's been with us now for 2 decades, and it hasn't changed in any real substantive way. In fact, it only seems to be growing. So, it's possible that we turn a corner here because a head of state was apparently murdered by a for-hire hit squad. But at the same time, you can go back and find story after story of some really dark ways in which, private security and mercenary operations have impacted security in countries around the world. So I'm not holding my breath for a huge change here.
Well, and it's one of these situations where it's also hard to put the genie back in the bottle, because one of the most poignant parts of Ryan's story is that it's not unusual, right? There's that exact quote in your piece where it says, well, it's not unusual, and it's not like that makes it as though we can't, be concerned about it just because it's common.
Right, it's a supply and demand problem.
Yes,
there is a supply of these fighters, and there is a demand for their services.
Yeah.
And it's going to take a kind of a forceful government intervention to step in, and there's no reason to think that in the near future there's an appetite for that.
No, there's not.
Well, Ryan, terrific reporting. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll tell you what's on our radars up next.